Maybe it is still down. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to give the other students about a minute or so to get in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Cassandra Stewart. I'm one of the department managers for the Counselor Education Department here at the Chicago School. And presenting today, we have Dr. Cody Dixon and Dr. Michelle Colarusso from our Counselor Education Department. So I'm going to turn things over to them so they can go ahead and get started. If you guys have any questions, just throw them in the chat and we'll take them as they come in.
Thank you, Cassandra. Okay. All right, well, welcome everybody to our little lunch and learn today on telehealth training for site supervisors and clinicians. Just a quick little note. My name, obviously, Dr. Cody Dixon. I am the Director of Clinical Training here at the Chicago School. Along with Dr. Colarusso, we work in pretty much all areas of training for our students, work with site supervisors, university supervisors, clinicians, students, everyone, to make sure that they have a positive and productive fieldwork experience. Just a note on myself, I also am a site supervisor and a licensed professional counselor supervisor in Texas. So I kind of do all the levels of supervision at this point. And look forward to a conversation today and focus on telehealth. Dr. Colarusso.
We also are site supervisors for our virtual clinical training center at the Chicago School, where Dr. Dixon and I are kind of on the support VCTC students at the virtual clinical training center through telehealth services with different partnerships at different sites that we have, physical location sites that kind of refer clients to us through that way. So we both are site supervisors for our doctoral and our doctoral students in that capacity as well.
Okay. All right, so our agenda for today, we're going to cover a definition of telehealth and telesupervision. That can be a tricky one for some folks to understand. We want to go through a couple of definitions and kind of drill down on what that really looks like. Telesupervision considerations for students, for site supervisors, for university supervisors, for postgraduate supervision. Some practical and practice tips, cover some telehealth laws and some telehealth ethics as we go. Hello, Dr. Andy Brown. Yes.
So we just kind of want to get an idea of where everyone is and how your current role applies to telehealth and or telehealth supervision. So if you could just kind of throw in the chat what your current role is, so we can kind of have an idea as to who everyone is, where you are, and where you're working, and how does telehealth apply to your current role. If you could kind of just put in the chat, that would be really, really helpful, so we can kind of gauge and get an idea where everyone is located.
Thank you, Dr. Crowley.
So a lot of telehealth, a lot of online programs. Sounds like a plan.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Saw quite a few of our faculty there too. So everyone, but specifically you faculty, I'll call on you. Feel free to pop in at any time and make any comments on any of the things that we're covering today, and see if we can make this nice and engaging for everyone. Oh, okay, great. I did want to ask really quick, is anyone, or this next slide, any of you, are you currently site supervisors for us, for example, for our school, for our programs? Well, they're waiting, Nancy, if you want to go ahead and move forward.
Mhm.
Thank you.
All right, so our first case example, so we're going to revisit this. So we're not going to necessarily answer this question currently, but this is going to be our case example that we're going to revisit after we go through all of the presentations. So essentially we have a master's student in professional counseling who's working at a university counseling center in Texas. They're 31 years old, and they have worked in the field as a mental health counselor in the bachelor's level for the last 5 years. We are working as her site supervisor. So she is not trained in telehealth, but wants to learn and provide telehealth services due to it having a flexible schedule for herself. She is in her first semester of internship at the counseling center at the university. We gave her her first telehealth client, who is from New York, but at the university, but is also a telehealth client. So she's in Texas. The student is at the university, but lives in New York. She has some anxiety at the beginning of the session, some suicidal thoughts, and kind of finished the session, and they did really well. They plan to meet next week. However, the student is going home to New York for spring break. So our student is going to meet with you to kind of review what the session, what happened in the session, what the plans are, but the student missed her supervision, is unable to touch base with you. So the student has a telehealth appointment with her client, and goes on, notices that the background is different, but doesn't think anything of it. So she continues the appointment as scheduled. And then now where we left off and where we're going to pick up at the end of this presentation is we are in supervision with Sarah, who is the client, or who is the who's the student. So as we kind of work through, we will revisit this exact same case example and kind of talk through what our concerns are as a site supervisor, what any ethical or illegal state violations, if any, that they had, licensing requirements, as well as training at all levels and all parties involved with this case. So we will see this again. We just kind of wanted to introduce it to everyone.
Yes. My channel there. All right, so what is telehealth? There are multiple definitions of telehealth when you go and look them up to find out from different agencies, different programs, government programs, insurance like HPSO, all of the various different, not only government, but just local or state agencies. And as we have here, the most, I think, concise, the HPSO and the SAMHSA definitions are some of the best that make it very clear. You know, it's the use of that communication that you're using for telehealth purposes, for health related services, you know, across some distance. And that distance can literally be, you could have a clinician in one room and someone else in the same room and within the same building, or it could be states and miles and countries apart. But the important part is it is a two-way communication in real time, interactive audio and video capability. that you can already have a plan in place for if there are problems. Many states have different laws about how that can be done. We will talk about some of those later. So you definitely want to check with your states, check your statutes, regulations, policies, your licensing board. You check them all before initiating your services. And one of our common things around here is, I would check with my insurance. I would check with the board in which I practice and in which the individual is currently residing, to make sure that you're even eligible to do so within those states or within their policies, procedures, and statutes.
And I think one of the other things, we're going to talk about what telehealth is not in a little bit, but one of the other things about telehealth is specifically audio and video. And I think we have kind of, as a profession and as a country, I will say, have kind of moved into that expectation. But whenever it was COVID and everyone was kind of just like throwing together haphazardly, how are we going to meet with people at all levels, right? Whether it was students, whether it was clients, whether it was medical appointments, right? Sometimes, I mean, all of us have probably had a phone session at some point during that time with clients. And so I think that it's important to define telehealth, but also keep in mind that these are just 3 bullet points of what telehealth is, but thinking about how forward and how we are moving forward as a profession and in healthcare to have define expectations around telehealth and kind of set more strict boundaries around what that looks like instead of, kind of where we started. So it has come a long way. Has anyone not used telehealth as a modality for clients, and or has anyone not used telehealth as a model for supervision? Anyone not use telehealth? We kind of figured that might be a large no, but we wanted to ask.
Okay. Picture again. So what telehealth is not. I think the biggest, and we probably talk about a couple of situations here in a second. I think the biggest is that it is not for the convenience of the clinician. You have to ethically, you have to ethically and legally consider your client. You need to make sure that you're not doing it because that's the only approach. Now, if you have an office that runs 100% just telehealth, and that's what you do, that is one thing. But there are many things we'll talk about that you'll need to cover with that individual to make sure they understand that setup. The other thing is also it's not for all clients. There are a lot of issues for telehealth related things for clients, and you cannot just assume that the client who says yes, that works for me really works for them, or if they're just saying that out of some level of not wanting to come to the office, they feel it's just convenient. Been my experience, it typically happens with those individuals that are having mental health related issues and they don't want to get out of the house. Either they don't want to get dressed and come, or they have some agoraphobia or some fears or some other things going on which they do not want to get out. Sometimes you need to work within that to find out what is best for them. I don't think it's really a hard or fast rule. It's really your clinical knowledge of them and their presenting issue. I know for me, a lot of times, if it's a person that's suffering with some depression and anxiety, you're working pretty early on and trying to get them in there, because we all know one of the best things for our clients is just that health and wellness. So getting up, taking a shower, putting on new clean clothes, and moving out of the house, as painful as that can be for some people, that's kind of the work we want to do. I know that Dr. Coloroso mentioned this a minute ago, and we saw it a lot in COVID too. It's not that brief little phone chat where you just do this little check-in. That's not telehealth. That's not counseling. That's not anything in our field. That is just having a talk with them, to set up an appointment. Maybe they called you in a crisis. That's fine, right? We all understand that, but not at a point where we want those to be a common thing with the client, because you do not want to get them into that kind of approach. I would say the same thing when it comes to supervision, is not building an expectation with a counselor in training that just checking in with you via phone is enough. You really need to have those interactions similar to your client interactions.
And I
And
think too, like whenever we talk about convenience, sometimes with supervision, we fall into that category of, oh, I'll just, drive to work in the morning, and I will, while my supervisee is driving to work in the morning, and we'll just have our supervision there because it's convenient for me. It saves me an hour as I drive to the office or drive to work or drive my family to school or whatever it is. So let's just do that. Or, oh, well, I have to miss my supervision, or I'm going to be late, so why don't we just do it over the phone? Or, oh, I have to leave early, why don't we just meet over the phone, right? Our field has changed a lot, and many of us on this call probably never had site supervision. That was, if you missed a supervision, if you weren't physically in the office, you weren't having it, because that wasn't even a thing before COVID, really. Maybe for some of us it still was, but really we can fall into the trap of convenience very easily. And sometimes we have to ask ourselves if we are providing the best experience for not only ourselves as supervisees, but or supervisors, but for supervisees. Are we giving them the best experience? Are we fully present in that session? And so sometimes when we talk about what telehealth and what telesupervision is not, it really aligns with the convenience aspect. Does anyone else have any other thoughts around kind of pitfalls or things that they have seen or experienced around telesupervision or telehealth with clients or with supervisees?
Yeah. Or any personal approaches or theoretical approaches that you would want to maybe mention here?
Are you looking for, Cody, when you talk about like the things that you would use telebehaviorally that you may not use face-to-face, or things that you use in both situations?
All the above.
Okay. I've kind of gone to more of a feedback informed supervision model because I really like the common factors and what have you. There's a lot of research and stuff that show, and it's common. I know I haven't actually read the stat, but there's like a stat that floats around that says something like 90% of therapists think they're in the top 10% of therapists. And while I'm a little bit math impaired, and 4 out of 3 of us are in probably the counseling field, I recognize that those numbers don't actually mesh up. And some of the research I know, Duncan and a few others have put out research to show that the subjective forms of feedback, the objective forms of feedback really help to clarify, any kind of struggles that you have in supervision or with the supervisee. And so I've been implementing that a little bit more. And now they've, of course, like with everything else, they've adapted to that you can do the common factors assessment, like the sessions assessment and those kinds of things, actually virtually. So but that's what I've been using more for. And again, I do more mentoring now than I do supervision, because I like the interpersonal connection, and I also loathe the paperwork that comes with supervision typically. So, but I've been using that more, and it's been incredibly effective for me.
Great, thank you.
Megan, it's interesting that you put that in the chat, because when I was also I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so for context, but when I was in community mental health settings, there was a big shift, and this kind of speaks to community mental health, but there was a big shift in productivity and work hours and not quote unquote paying people for supervision because a lot of it was licensure supervision. So a lot of those things and a lot of the supervision did happen outside of work hours because they wanted it to, because they didn't want to necessarily pay someone for licensure supervision because it took away the productivity aspect of what that was like. So I appreciate that you put that in there because it's definitely something that I have seen.
You're exactly right. There is a massive shift, and there has been, at least I've seen in community mental health with our folks on the ground, of licensure supervision kind of being put on the back burner. And so what happens is that administrative supervision, like your direct report, is considered in your working hours, but then your licensure supervision is happening more frequently outside of working hours because of productivity. And telesupervision is the way you can make that work, because the organization or the agency is expecting that employee to continue work, even if it's for licensure supervision outside of work hours. It's just something that I'm seeing more frequently. And I'm also curious just to kind of hear, other thoughts of managing that, because it's more of a collaborative kind of way to attend to supervision than I was used to before. So thank you for affirming that.
Unfortunately, for affirming it, right? Yeah.
Dr. Crowley added in the chat, just very much forces more administrative supervision to occur versus the clinical supervision that we really want to spend the time with. As Dr. Brown said, the part that he doesn't like, the administrative part. Thank you.
Dr. Dixon and Dr. Colarusso, something else that you reminded me of is when doing DBT, you do meet with clients or have the intercession contact between the therapist and the client in between the sessions. And then sometimes that leads to, because you have consultation groups for the clinicians, times where you do have these random or unexpected phone calls to kind of support the clinician who's supporting the client. So there's almost like a parallel process of phone calls that you didn't always expect, but still kind of fall into that weird liminal telehealth space.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think too, like you brought up a good point, like it is very much role dependent too, right? Like there are some where we're going to talk about informed consent, but being able to set up those expectations of this is when I am available, this is when I'm not available, this is how I'm available, this is when I'm not available. And it really depends on what your role is. DBT is very much a modality, if you're doing it correctly, or properly, or the organic way, I guess I should say it, but that requires a lot of those interventions outside of the session and phone calls, and they're expected versus one-on-one outpatient therapy. You don't necessarily have those crisis calls, or if that's how you set up the role or expectations.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, all of you kind of made me think the other issue that comes along when you're dealing with clients and the telehealth partner, those check-in things, is then you run into the to bill or not to bill. And that's where we get into those laws and all those other things, right? So there's so many little nuances that you have to think about and how to manage some of these, what telehealth is and what it's not, and how to do the theoretical approaches or your clinical approaches with different clients. All right. Yes, when somebody pop in there that they run into issues where clients feel like they can just contact me anytime. I would assume that you're referring to, like, when you're doing telehealth, there's more of that other than the people you see that come into your office. They're like, I have this set appointment with the doctor, so to speak, with the counselor, with whatever. They hold things till their session for the most part, right? For the most part. But when you're doing telehealth, you absolutely can run into, and I do find that with some of my telehealth people, it makes it a little easier for them to cancel sometimes. Makes it a little easier for them to just try to start texting you or calling you or doing other things like that. So no, that's absolutely absolutely important.
And I feel like too, even just, canceling last minute, all I have to do is click a button to get on versus, well, I'm going to be late because it's a 30-minute drive.
And yes, thank you, Dr. TRW. So from a technical aspect, thinking about telehealth, one of the big things for telehealth and telesupervision, and one of the things you'll see if you attend any of the numerous trainings that we'll talk about later, where you can get certified or whatever. These are things that you have to think from a technical perspective. Think about firewalls, well-maintained and reliable technology. I don't know about you guys, but the part of Texas I live in, I have another professor friend of mine that is here. Some of us have 2 or 3 different routers and services because 1 or 2 of they'll just go down and it just happens. So that kind of things. And that's just being from just natural wind or things like that. Do you have either the appropriate fiber optic lines in your own house going between you and the pole? Make sure that, are there any other issues that could lead to any kind of failure transmission of not just the session, but also your electronic health records and damaging and failed transmissions and changes. Like it says, file corruptions, things like that. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Unauthorized third-party access, not just technologically, but even people in the room or around, which we'll talk about. And again, as we've talked in some of the other sessions I've heard this week, natural disasters, things that happen that interrupt services, COVID, where we had to do that quick switch from on ground to in person, and we had to do those things quickly. So there are a lot of those calls and check-ins and let's set it up. And as you talk about it, think back to some of the places and some of the just really funky ways people were trying to call things services that were so not HIPAA compliant and so, borderline unethical and but not out of a negative sense, more out of a sense that I need to get in to see I need to take care of my clients. I need to make money for myself. I need to keep my practice going. All these things are going on. Yes, it was absolutely the Wild West during COVID. That's a great point. All those things that happened, and you would just you would talk to people and you hear them, you like kind of get a twitch, thinking that's how they're doing supervision or counseling with people.
I'm sure we could all of us here remember that moment of if we were providing services, what was that transition like for us, right? Or for the agency that we worked with, or for our private practice, or for our clients. And, thinking of things that we did then that are really considered unethical now. We used the information that we had and the experience that we had, and we kind of had to, like the wild, wild west, just kind of do what we had to do. Right. And now it's kind of like you look back at some of those things and you're like, oh, that was probably super unethical. And we would probably end a session with a client if they were, on a bus having a session or walking around the grocery store having a session. When really then that was kind of okay.
Yeah, and then on the telesupervision end of it, like right here, it's like, is telesupervision your only option? If you think back to some of the early ons when some of the states, New York was one of them, that basically said, oh yeah, we can do all these things, telehealth with clients, but if y'all recall, New York was the state that said, but you had to have supervision in person. And that had to be reconsidered and renegotiated because this is April, May, June in that year. And people were just, it was that pandemic, people were terrified. And then we had these sites telling people that you had to continue coming in and you needed to have supervision in person. Those are the things you have to consider and think about just from a practical sense, even getting started.
And I think also too, especially with telesupervision, like thinking about your supervisee and their where they are developmentally, right? So if you have a practicum student, is telehealth or is telesupervision even appropriate, right? I mean, it really depends on the student, but, and even with newer clinicians, going for licensure that are in the field. Is telesupervision appropriate? I think sometimes we have to be able to, we're going to talk about screening in a little bit, but not only screening our clients, and, you know, Dr. Rush Wilson mentioned this earlier of, you know, being able to kind of understand the parallel process of, we might be doing this with our clients, but we also have to understand the importance of screening our supervisees for, telehealth supervision and setting those expectations. And like, I think Kristen said it earlier, setting boundaries ahead of time, but also setting boundaries with our supervisees around our expectations. You know, if you can't show up in person, we're going to meet every Monday at 12 in person. But if you can't be there, like, you just missed for that week. Like, I can't, I'm not doing, again, out of the convenience, or what does that look like? Or where are your flexibility in that, if at all? So we're going to talk about informed consent, but being able to kind of also consider these for supervisees as well.
Thank you, Ebony, for your comment in there about, yeah, you being in New Jersey. And then Danielle, yeah, some of the creative ways that we've had to do some of the things with telehealth. I like the approach. You know, people can do different things. I like the approach of, if at all possible, having that first session face-to-face, or whatever combination you want, right? You can have like that session face-to-face, or that very first one, or maybe you set up having face-to-face sessions every once in a while, or maybe you never do them. But there are so many different ways to do these, and kind of these hybridized ways that work best for everyone. And again, that goes to what we'll talk about here: client fit and your practice. Okay, what do we got here? I got my stuff in my. All right, so telesupervision practice tips, kind of things, and again, all of you are putting some good ones in there, and so we look forward to hearing you if you have other little tips for other folks that are outside of this. I'm sure there are, because I think that since I think that since COVID, there's been a lot of people that have gone out and really added to their training and education on supervision and telehealth and clinical work on this. So some of the things that we talk about, some of the things we'll talk about, like your informed consent, is, you know, making sure you have policies and procedures in place for very specific training, for continuing education, for all your clinicians, all your supervisors. Let them know, you know, like with your informed consent, let them know what training, what experience, what to expect, who you are, and how you came about doing it from this telehealth approach. Site supervisors provide, you know, evidence of policies for providing supervision for counselors in training who are engaged in telehealth. And if I remember correctly, Dr. Kohler, so these were part of what we utilize ourselves within the program. When we share with students and site supervisors within our program, we share these points right here. And what we did is, when we were going through some of the COVID things and other things that were happening, and then post-COVID, we reached out and we went through as many states as we could, and or that we knew there was changes. And basically, a lot of these points, again, come from the state of New York, because they hold some of the most strict rules on telehealth. And since we train students all over the world, we want to follow the most restrictive for everyone, so that there's no violations of anything for anyone in a different state, stuff like that. So keep that in mind as we're talking through this, especially if you're site supervising for us. You know, develop and provide evidence of procedures for obtaining informed consent prior to them starting the remote services, making sure you're going through those. If you're using an electronic EHR, sending that information out to them, making sure they've signed those consents. Ensure that informed consent is both the benefits and the risk. This is an insurance-based thing. Make sure that people understand the risk management issues, those technology issues we were talking about, their fit. You maybe have to explain to a client at one point that qualifies, so to speak, for the lack of a better word, qualifies for telehealth, but then later comes to some change, and you feel that they need to start coming in instead. Conducting an initial assessment of the client, to make sure, again, fitness, given their treatment needs, given their ability to come in, determining alternatives or considering other referrals if these things aren't the best for them. And again, making sure you know the relevant laws, telehealth laws. That one of the tricky parts about telehealth laws is telehealth laws are at a federal communication level. They're at a state level. They can be at a regional and even a city or county level. So you need to make sure you're aware of all those things, and people don't always think about that. But those are important things to know. And then just making sure you're not practicing outside of your scope, or the students aren't practicing outside of their scope. I can say that me and Dr. Colarusso get a little jumpy when so many students come in and they want to do telehealth only or something like that. And they've not really done, maybe they've taken the telehealth class, but they've not really done some of these things. And we really like them to get started on the ground when and if possible. And that's why they have a 50% requirement from us. Like, we'll let them do 50-50 across their fieldwork experience, but no one is going to get 100% telehealth.
Well, and I feel like too, one of the things that we see a lot, and again, like, our job is to kind of protect both the site and the student, and kind of allow the student to make sure that they are able to get licensed and they are well-rounded clinicians. And sometimes, I have conversations with site supervisors specifically around helping them create boundaries, because students will say, oh, I want to go on vacation, or I'm doing this, but I can see clients whenever I'm there. And it's like, but no, they don't have any students, they don't have the same, I'll say, luxuries as a licensed person,
Rights and
to
privileges,
kind of
right?
practice and, take their clients with them. If we're licensed and we go somewhere else for 2 weeks and we still want to work while we're there, we have the ability to do that. Could they do that? Sure, but they don't. There needs to be oversight. There needs to be supervision. There needs to be you as a site supervisor need to be present with them as they're providing these hours. And so, we get a lot of pushback, but it's really because what happens if a client isn't doing well and, you're not with your site supervisor, or you don't have the support that you need in those sessions or in that moments too.
Yeah, and Dr. Crowley and Kristen both made a comment in here that, 100%. We have this conversation all the time about the 3 levels of licensure, sometimes 4 or 5, but in this case, the 3 levels of the student intern. I am a current student under the purview of multiple people watching my practice and what I can and cannot do. What does my state say I can do then? Then you have the pre-licensure postgraduate hours you have to do. What does my state say about my ability to do that? And do I need to know those rules? I will say that we strongly lean on the site supervisors in given states to make sure that those things are shared with the student, but we also follow up and keep an eye on that. And then what does it look like? So sometimes you get students, and this, I would say this is true anywhere I've taught, you get students who want to jump from I just graduated to I'm a fully licensed individual. And that is unethical, unsafe, and just flat not something we're willing to do. And, as site supervisors and as faculty members, these things get real tedious at times, especially as Dr. Crowley, who often teaches our internship to students. People get antsy, they're ready to start making money, they're ready to get out of school, and they're ready to move on. But that doesn't mean you're ready for every modality. Students who want to learn certain, they all want to run out and learn DBT or EMDR or something like that. And like, well, you're not really ready. I would prefer you practice for a while. You do A, B, and C for a while. We're their supervisors. And that's part of those conversations we have to have. And then, are the practices they're using with their clients translatable to telehealth services, and can you monitor that appropriately in telesupervision? I mean, would you rather, and this is a very much personal question for you folks as the supervisors, to say, I'm personally not comfortable because my license is at risk, or I'm perfectly okay with it.
Yeah, I think that's the other main thing that we try to encourage and support site supervisors, that whenever they're signing off on the hours, they're the first line of signature. And so their hours are what really, or their signature and their license and their word and their follow-up is really the most important part of student experience. And to be able to, like Dr. Dixon was saying, it's one thing to be able to learn DBT and learn EMDR and obtain all of those really great trainings and modalities, but it's something completely different to then take those learned modalities and to translate them to telehealth, because it looks very different. I know Dr. Brown does EMDR, and I'm going to call him out, and I hope he's listening, but it's very different, I would assume, to do it in person than to use technology and do it online.
Absolutely. One of the struggles I think that young clinicians or neophytes have is being able to understand you're watching and you're actually, some people think that EMDR or the progressive therapies, the power therapies or whatever, are devoid of relationship, but it's really not that way at all. You have to be very integrated into what they're doing, watch for agitation. And that's, of course, more challenging virtually when you're trying to watch only, the only part of the client that you can see on video for agitation to see if this client is accepting and reprocessing appropriately, if they're decompensating, these kinds of things, and what to do. Because what you do in session may be a little bit different than what you do virtually. And certainly there couldn't be some potential concerns with that. And so those are some dynamics that if you haven't dealt with those things, if you haven't had some experience, that experience can be challenging.
Absolutely. And what you, Dr. Brown, and then also you, Kristen, pointing out in your note is having that plan of action regarding how to handle crisis and situations when these things happen, for whatever modality you're using, but making sure, like you're saying, Dr. Brown, and you can't see what a client is doing if they're working to hide 3/4 of the body from you. Same thing with supervisees. I want a supervisee who's paying 100% attention. I really don't want their phone down here where they're just jacking around, not paying attention. Not paying attention to what they're supposed to be doing and listening to you because you may be addressing these very issues.
Some more things that we kind of talk about in our with site supervisors is making sure that, and Kristen kind of alluded to this in her plan in her comment, but making sure that we attend to self-harm, duty to warn, mandated reporting situations, because each of our states have different requirements about what that looks like. And really one of the other, to really assist with this, it's really important that, we even talk about where students are providing telehealth services, right? So it's one thing if students are coming into the office and they're providing telehealth services there versus providing telehealth services from their homes, right? So it's really, again, up to the site supervisor to determine their level of comfort around where that person is providing services to clients. And each one of us as a site supervisor would have very different answers maybe in what that looks like. But even just having a supervisee in your office to be able to walk over and support versus, you not know when they're having clients or when their sessions are and you not being in the office, that adds a lot of risk into that session and how to address that as well.
Yeah, I think, and while we're, you can go on to the next slide, but say, and then one part of like telesupervision that's interesting, especially, probably, I don't know, maybe more so with students, maybe more so with those students that are postgraduate, but keeping in mind that you as a site supervisor, you as a site supervisor or as a supervisor, whatever your role is, students and the counselors in training understanding that you have this earned level of autonomy based on your experience, education, and everything that they do not have yet. And they need to understand that you're at risk with your license, and that you have earned this autonomy to be able to dictate some of these things so that the things are safe for everyone around. You know, like Dr. Cullors was saying, Dr. Brown was saying, you know, the perfect example of an individual that you can't see on telehealth that's self-injurious, hurting themselves during the session, and you not being able to know. So again, goes to fit.
And then even, you know, remaining aware of what the limitations are, because once, a client might come in your first session and you might think, oh, wow, you know, this person is really appropriate for telehealth. And 2 months into it, they have something happen, or a life event, or, they become more symptomatic, and then they are not at all appropriate for telehealth services. And so being able to kind of understand and keep your finger on who, not only your clients, but your supervisees' clients, as to what happens if it changes, and what happens with that conversation to get the client to come back into the office, or come into the office at all, or refer to someone who does in-person services or a higher level of care, or whatever they need. But sometimes setting the expectation in your informed consent around what happens if we don't do telehealth anymore, or if their insurance changes and they don't provide telehealth services. So a lot of those limitations, we have to be aware of all of those ever-changing laws and regulations.
Absolutely. Let's see if we get everything on this. Well, we talked about it.
There
before.
has been a lot more research on the effectiveness around telehealth, and I would expect more to be happening as we're moving forward. But there has been a lot of research that does say it is as effective as in-person services. But again, they also say that it depends on the client.
Yeah, and part of the things on here for application for telesupervision and telehealth is some of these points we're making here is, again, that goes back to fit. And you might find as a supervisor, that's not only clients, but it may be supervisees that aren't the best fit. You may hold a policy that says, I don't allow student interns to do telehealth at all. That they have to, again, like we're saying, thanks, John, is earning that autonomy to be able to do these things. You earn it as you go on. You have that right with the sites, with a supervisee, to tell them, we have so many sites that we work with that I really appreciate the places that don't take my practicum students and toss them in with here's your brand new 5 clients. Be free, little one. Terrifies me. I'm much happier with the ones that are like, okay, well, I make them jump through 16 hoops before they get to what they need to do before I will even hand them the first client. Sometimes it's a little overkill. Sometimes it's done, but you know what? Students, supervisees are very different. Postgraduate supervisees, they all come with different challenges. And so, we have to really make sure that they are fit, that they have the competency levels, that they have, the technological levels, the understanding to do these things within your services. And we make a comment also about advertising. We've run into this a couple of times where we've had to talk to sites about how they've advertised our students on as far as them doing purely telehealth or what their services are, and making sure the places are very clear that this is how you use the word intern, how you use counselor in training, what level is that person? Are they a student? Are they a postgraduate student? What level are they? And exactly clear their level of skill and knowledge in the informed consent when you're sharing that with other people. Your job as supervisor is to make sure that they are then conveying this correctly in their sessions.
Because counselor, and when you hear counselor in training, every one of us goes to a different spot of what that looks like. And so there's so much ambiguity in just what a counselor in training is, that's why we kind of require them to make sure that they're marketed correctly as a student, specifically if they're providing telehealth services or they're charging for services.
Absolutely.
Last couple of practice tips for this slide is make sure that there's also sometimes struggles with telehealth when it comes to cultural barriers and language barriers and just difficulty in effectively communicating through a virtual modality and ways that we treat clients.
Yeah, making sure, you know, that they're employing all the professional standards of practice that they're supposed to be employing. Staying up on their documentation. We hate it when we get a meeting with a site supervisor, or if I'm a site supervisor and I'm finding out that a student hasn't done notes for a month. And I'll be completely honest with you, is I have two problems with that. I'm like, A, why are they a month behind? And B, as a supervisor, why have you not checked to see if those are an issue, you know? So those things that come up, you know, again, we're going to talk about language a little bit in a minute too, but, you know, making sure that they have the telehealth and clinical competencies to be able to do telehealth, to even offer the service. Make sure that they have knowledgeable colleagues, supervisors, people in the building, if you're not available, to say, yes, I can help you with those things. And we talked about this earlier, and we'll talk about it all the time, is, you know, consulting an attorney. Specific legal questions arise, that is okay. Like we said, and if Dr. TRW was on here, she would say the same thing. Contacting your state board, contacting your lawyer, HPSO lawyer. You know, the faculty that I work most closely with, it is not unusual for us to call our insurance company lawyer. Pretty common. I think it's either Dr. Foster or Dr. TRW who can name this person by name. But they actually give me the name when they say, oh, I call so-and-so all the time. I'm like, okay, well, that's a really intimate conversation, a really intimate relationship with your state board or whatever. But do those things, you know, and make students.
Empower students to do that on their own. Sometimes, you know, they come to ask a lot of questions and we want to provide the answers, but also it's empowering for them to be able to, even though it might be really difficult, because it is, navigating any state board is probably difficult. But allowing them and empowering them to receive those answers or get the answers themselves is much more valuable to them than sometimes us just saying, you know, here's what you need, here's the bullet points, because we know it, right? But it's also important for them to know those things as well.
So before we move on to the next one, I just want to check in and see, oh, I saw something come in the chat. 1 second there. Check in with all of you and see if there's anything that maybe we've missed. I would love to hear anything that you found as a student, as a clinician, as a whatever. Maybe practical tips and practice tips we missed. I do see a Elizabeth. Hold on 1 second. We have to release people to speak. I'm gonna let you say that one for me because that's a lot of
Dr.
work.
Dixon.
Oh, yes. Hi, Dr.
I
Crowley.
apologize. I'll make it quick, but one of the big conversations we've been having here in my state is the rollback of provisions that were permitted during COVID. And especially as it pertains to how much supervision can occur online versus how much has to occur in person, versus does your first session with a potential supervisee need to be in person? We have a lot of really strict statutes that talk about if you're providing telehealth as a pre-grad and or pre-licensure intern, the importance of having a supervisor physically present with you, not just available to you. And how many of these privileges that were afforded during our COVID pandemic are now being rolled back, yet people aren't necessarily rolling back with them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Crowley. That is a huge one. And Elizabeth, you had some good comments in there. If you don't mind, you should be able to speak now. Go ahead and talk about that, because you said something in there that I completely forgot about, and I'm actually ashamed to forgot about it because I've been in that situation. So if you don't mind just kind of saying what you had put in the chat there.
Oh, so I live in a state, I think only Alaska has more frontier than we do. And so how we have to do our work is quite different than somewhere in a suburban or city situation. So without telehealth video and audio, we wouldn't be able to provide sessions for our patients. We wouldn't be able to provide supervision for our developing counselors. There's some places that don't even have internet. And so how we have to do business is so much different.
You know, it's funny you say that. I've got an entirely different presentation on just working in rural and frontier and front range areas. That the biggest problem when you look into the research from some of the rural mental health and some of just rural health initiatives and stuff is the absolute lack of, number one, bandwidth and services.
Yes.
And what state are you in?
I'm in Oregon.
Oregon. Okay, so Oregon. I was in Nebraska. Same thing. And you know, I moved up there from Texas, and we're a big state, but never really thought about that frontier perspective that people talk about. That you know, the open range kind of area where you go for a very long period of time where there's nothing. And so that also means that there's a distinct lack of service in the community, but there's a distinct lack of, like you said, you burn through your bandwidth just being here. And that is so painfully true. And even with all the grant money and all the services to be provided, when we were talking about it earlier, you know, that sometimes becomes a local and county level issue to be reaching out for the finances to the government and to your the resources to have bandwidth put into your own neighborhood. Take care of it.
We had when it was COVID, we kind of ran into the similar situation a little, Elizabeth, but even though I'm in Pittsburgh and it's a pretty large area, the counties surrounding are not. And that was one of the things that we had to advocate for when I was in a community mental health setting, is exactly a lot of our clients, they couldn't even do a 60-minute counseling session during COVID because it would eat up all of their minutes available to them on their phone, or they would not be able to access services for that long, or they wouldn't be able to access the internet for that long, or they couldn't afford to be in a place for an hour that was private without internet, and it wasn't a stable situation at all. And we had to advocate to a lot of different people to increase some of those minutes or allow them to come in and provide, you know, telehealth services like we were talking about at the beginning. But there was a lot of barriers to that treatment for sure.
Right. And it becomes a political thing as well.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because most of Central and Eastern Oregon is very conservative, don't want to pay taxes. And so there's not even the funds to help support. And they just don't want state and federal involvement. So it becomes really tricky just navigating the levels of complexity.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Those are great points. Anybody have anything to add before we move forward to the next section? You can go ahead, Dr. Culver. Oh, our friends, ethics. Hold on 1 second. So there is no intent right here for us to go through every one of these telehealth ethical standards, but we put this slide in here simply to illustrate all of the standards that are in place that we have to consider simply from an ethical standpoint. Access, we were just talking about, I'm staring out on the screen, access to services and communication differences. And, you know, it's kind of funny, as Elizabeth was talking, if we look at this, I think about my kids. I live in a city with 300,000 people, but it's nicknamed the hub city because the next largest towns, roughly its size or bigger, are more than 325 miles away to the closest large city. So all that area in between is dead air a lot of times. So I laugh at my kids because we're traveling, they get mad because their tablets or their phones or whatever electronics go to crap on them for, a good 80 to 100 miles at times. Well, that also means that there are people living there that do not have that access either. And you can't assume. So there's people out there that need that service, but all of these standards pointing that we have to consider every one of these ethical issues
Well, and think of how many run into one another, right? You know, Elizabeth, just like you were talking about the access, but then also effectiveness of services. So if someone doesn't have access to do video and audio, is that effectiveness, is it better than them having nothing, right? Is a phone call or without video, or I'm sorry, yeah, without video, better than no access at all, right? And so sometimes these are like the ethical dilemmas really that we have to kind of decide whenever it comes to our clients. And there are a lot up here, and these are a lot, you know, I wonder how many students, you know, we talk about the ACA Code of Ethics all the time, but really understand how we put these in place, or what these decisions mean, or, you know, how heavy some of these decisions are based off of our own licensure, our own limitations for our liability insurance, as well as then just, okay, we want to provide service to clients. So, you know, there's a lot of dilemmas within all of these different ethical standards that sometimes we go through really quickly, and we can kind of make those decisions, but we have to really help students walk through and supervisees walk through the understanding of what does it mean to make that decision between access and effectiveness of services, or even benefits and limitations of what that looks like. And, you know, all of these are very much intertwined, but having to help them, students sometimes make decisions, it's challenging.
You know, and this also goes back to, well, presentation we were doing earlier this week on ethical decision-making models and things like that. So one of the issues there is, if you're considering doing telehealth with someone, we have this many considerations we have to think about ethically for us to move forward. So, you know, if you're thinking, oh, okay, it's just that simple, it's really not. You know, you have to go through all of these steps, plus all the things we've already talked about technologically wise, which is also in here, to make sure that these things can be done. I mean, you guys were just talking about people being in places where they couldn't. So can they go to places? Can they go? Are there places that have Wi-Fi where they could drive their car and have to set out in their vehicle and do it? You know, access to clinics. You know, Dr. Colarusso brought up the virtual training clinics that we have. So a lot of our students see people that are in places just like this, and we work on grants and other things so that we can provide the technology for people to be able to see a clinician. And so you have to consider all of these things. So you're talking to students and you're supervising folks and you're doing telehealth, we have to make sure that those other folks outside of us supervisors are aware of all of these issues. And then, you know, it's so often for us when we have an issue coming up with a student, which impacts the site supervisors and you guys as supervisors, run into issues like of us having to look at these and go, okay, which one of these could be a potential problem, or what is the problem right now? What am I going to go through, and what are the steps to be able to address this problem? Let me see. Anybody have any other comments to add before we move forward? Anything on ethics that jumps out?
Any examples that have come up that
Just looking at these make you think, ooh, that could be a problem for me. Oh. Hopefully I didn't scare everyone off with the ethics discussion. Let's see. All right. I guess this I open the chat so I can watch it, but then it gets in my way sometimes. So informed consent process. So we all have our informed consents, right? And they look like one thing. And so if you're doing telehealth, they're going to look a lot longer. They're going to have these other considerations. And I know that we put it at the bottom, but number one is just screening for fit before they even anything. You have this conversation, have this professional ethical decision making through your own mind and say, is this going to be the best person for telehealth? You may meet them the first time on telehealth and feel like maybe they are, and find out later they're not. You may meet them in person and go, yeah, this person could do telehealth. Their level of need is at a point where that's appropriate. or all of the other things we've talked about that are challenges for them, you know. You really have to go into like these full discussions with folks, describing, yeah, what is telehealth really like? What does it look like? Like, how's it different from in person? Like, how, you know, make sure you're providing these things in writing. Like, what is the scope of the service? What's the scope of your training? Again, the things we mentioned before. What trainings do you have? What experience do you have? Making sure that you're working within your own scope, but also reassuring them that they understand you are, providing them all the information about your electronic health record, communications, follow-up, like Dr. TRW said earlier, and maybe the phone check-ins that are just a quick 5-minute, are you still with me? How you doing? Kind of talk, checking in on things, you know, mandatory reporting, well checks, billing must be in there. Let's see, you know, providing all your credential information. And then just knowing that there may be a time where you're going to require them to come into the office for a reason, or that you may have them see another, you in an in-person setting, or see a healthcare provider in a setting. Earlier this week, we were talking about just that, is do we you know, do you expect people to go in for a health check? Do you want your people, if you're going to see them only in telehealth, well, should you have some consultation? Should they have some consultation with their medical doctor? Maybe the reason they're not coming in is a medical reason, but you want some assurance that they're going to be okay. Talking to them about sending someone over for us to the second, or well checks, letting them know that, hey, if you're set for a schedule and you're supposed to meet with me at a certain time, or you're supposed to do A, B, and C, and you haven't done this, that may result in me contacting your safety person. And we can talk about that, like people having someone that's on the ground near them that makes that covers for safety issues if that's necessary. Making sure that that, you know, maybe that's a family member, maybe it's just like local champions on the ground, like we call them, like, you know, local crisis lines and stuff like that, because of the distance that you're in. And then one more really big important part, and we don't really talk about enough, I feel sometimes, is your professional will. What does that mean? What's a professional will? That is making sure that they know if something happens to you, the person that will take over your services, the person who may be contacting them, the person may be following up, is this individual. How is that person qualified? What is the process in case you became incapacitated or something happened where you were not able to help that client? That is, even as much as that's important in person, at least in person, they know where they can go. On telehealth, where are they supposed to go? They may not know. So they need to know that this person may be reaching out for you in your leave, you know.
And I think one of the other things too is, like, you know, as site supervisors and clinicians, we might understand this process, but sometimes we have a really difficult time with just students that are afraid to have these conversations, or they get really nervous about talking about these things with clients, and their fear in having to like disappoint a client or say, I can't see you anymore, you have to come in person, right? Kind of like the giving the bad news, right? And even sometimes with asking, you know, clients to record, that can be nerve-wracking, and we all been there. Like, it is very nerve-wracking. But practicing these conversations with students or with your supervisees, so they can learn how to start having these conversations around what happens if your client isn't doing well and you need them to come in person. How to rearrange their schedule to accommodate clients needing to come in person, or what does that look like for your office? So with all of these informed consent process, there's, like, you know, a bunch of little things underneath them that go into that, but kind of making sure that we go over all of those things with students specifically early on, and making sure that they are following up with you, or they're going over all of these informed consent process. Because sometimes it's really easy for students to just be like, I don't really need to do that. Like, it's not really important. And then something comes up and we're like, okay, well, did you go over the informed consent? You can just talk to them about what that was. Oh, I don't think I went over that. Or, oh yeah, I think we did. Or, I don't know, like I told the client to look it over and I had them sign it. Right. We've all been in situations where that has come up, I'm sure. Because it's pretty common, especially with students, they get nervous, or new clinicians, they get nervous. So having them practice and go through and writing their own informed consent, even if you have one as a practice, having them write their own informed consent is really important.
Yes, and just a quick reminder, so this is part 1 of part 2. Tomorrow will be some site supervisor things, and we'll go over some more informed consents and some other information and stuff that also go with this. So this is part of what we're covering today is still just the first part of a longer series of things. Hopefully you guys can join us. Keep going. We still have some. All right, so I just want to take a moment or so for all of you to kind of look through these. These are really fundamental state telehealth consideration questions that that arise. Like they're for me, they're kind of rhetorical from my perspective, but for you guys, I'm just looking through this list of questions of things you have to consider in each one of your states on the reimbursement and or services or restrictions or who can do what, when, why, and how, like all of the
And this is a lot of these questions are, ones we probably look at and we're like, oh, I don't really know, or I do know, but I looked 2 years ago. And
Yeah.
a lot of these questions are, one, they're ever changing. So we have to be aware of where, each one of our states are moving and where they're going and what things that they're talking about. I know Dr. Crowley was talking about things that they're starting to roll back. Maybe they're not in place right this minute, but they're heading that way. And so how do you prepare for those changes, or how do you prepare for making changes to students, or making changes to supervision or to clients, or what does that look like from them? And again, coming from a place of, we want you to get licensed in your state. We want you to do everything you possibly can to get licensed in your state. And our goal is that you meet those requirements. And if they don't, or if they do something that they make the decision on their own to say, well, I'm just going to do 100% telehealth, we can't guarantee that they're going to get licensed. We can't guarantee that you are going to get licensed in your state with the choices that they make sometimes.
Absolutely. And then, there's a lot of questions just at again, this is not only just, this is state, could be county, can be local levels that you have to consider. Most of these are questions about your state, but these are not just for you as the clinician, but they're also for you as a site supervisor. And again, our supervisor, programs, once we graduate, someone lean heavily again on their postgraduate and their in-school supervisors to help them understand these things in their area the best. So as much as people are kind of in our field, because we're always feel like we're just so, sometimes altruistic about these things, and we hate talking about money at times, but then it's like we have to survive. We're here in the field to make money and survive and help people and do all these things. So this, this goes back to like reimbursements and all of those things that you as a site supervisor, you as a clinician, and you and students need to understand at their state and local levels. Because again, we would always hate for students to understand them at the federal or national levels and then kind of have some idea at the state level, but then run into something more regionally or locally that is also a problem. So these are just questions to kind of ask yourself.
Well, I think too, even understanding, I don't know about all of you, but even just in this last year, when I've had a lot of my own clients renew their insurance, like the past, whenever it was COVID, they had a lot of, there was still a lot of credentialing concerns with not only just telehealth, but their new insurance policy. So it would be a $0 copay for telehealth. And then people would want to do telehealth because it was free or it was cheaper. And now they're kind of seeing, insurance companies, they want to make money. So they're like, oh, well, all these people are doing telehealth. Let's charge $5 more for a telehealth copay and, $5 less for an in-person. And so even just understanding and having to communicate those changes, because again, we're not doing it out of convenience, but sometimes clients do it for themselves out of convenience because it was cheaper or because during COVID, insurance companies covered a lot of copays. And now they're not doing that as much. So how do we understand like the copays and the prior authorizations and, what that looks like from the insurance perspective, along with just what are our state concerns?
You make a good point. Two things that came to mind. One, me as a clinician living in Texas during COVID, I had a couple of clients that had certain insurance company, and the clients pretty much, I don't know what you tell them when they're pretty much demanding to do online because their insurance company, their policies, and because of who their employer was, these individuals would get free telehealth or they'd have to pay to come into the office. And so they'd be like, no, I want to do the telehealth because I can do that with no copay. But I had to pay a copay if I come into your office. So I'm like, okay, well, thank goodness none of those were at a level of illness and issue that they couldn't do that. But it made me very anxious because sometimes I'm like, I will waive the copay because I need to see you in the office. Like, come on, something, And then another one that we ran into, me and Dr. Colarusso, that really burned me bad was after the certain state, after one of our students, the COVID policies changed in their state and at their site put it on the students and the clinicians in their building to notify people that they were no longer taking a certain insurance, and now they were only taking this one insurance, and that one insurance was now going to cost them $60 copays instead of the 20 or 30 they were paying. And we had to have a conversation with the site for many reasons. We felt it was unethical to their clients the way they were doing it. And we felt it was unethical to have a student intern doing bill collection. So those things are things that changed at a state level. We really had no control. And so those are the kind of things we have to, again, consider and think about all the time when considering telehealth yet again.
Does anyone have any specific, like their own state related? I know Dr. Crowley talked about her state, but does anyone else have any like state specific things that have really changed since COVID that have been either challenging or positive?
Yeah, please share if you do. I mean, we have students everywhere. So for us, it's very beneficial to hear from people in different states so that we can say, hey, I've heard this before. Okay. I'll move on. All right, so if you could just pop in the chat for us, maybe a short couple of sentences on what scenarios, now that you've seen this, now that you do what you're doing, what scenarios, if any, is telehealth not appropriate? Like when would you? That's true, Christian. I wish it was. Yeah, if y'all could pop in the chat some comments on just what you find not appropriate. Thank you, Megan.
Even telehealth or telesupervision, anything that you feel like is not
telesupervision,
appropriate, that you wouldn't do telesupervision with a student or with a supervisee.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. And a partner violence for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one we run. That's a really good point, John, because you run into two issues there. One, people wanting to do telehealth because they don't want to get caught by the partner going to counseling. The person who's trying to do telehealth, and then that abusive individual finding their phone, catching them in a session, want to know, hey, who is this Michelle chick you're talking to or whatever? Like, Yeah, no. Let me see, I missed some of
Yeah,
that.
burnout is really, really, really important. Yes, if someone has consistent technology,
Yes,
yes.
actually a huge one. Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, that definitely, and that's what I run into here is the people who were saying they want to do this. I have to do this telehealth. It's cheaper, blah, 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 but their bandwidth sucked or their services stunk or whatever it was. And I could never feel like you could never feel like you're getting a good service. Same thing with supervision. Like, we experienced that as an online program, right? With students who don't have the greatest um service and they're in class trying to present a video or interact and they can't and they can't be properly supervised because they just give up or go off camera to save bandwidth. Let's see what else. Burnout, that's a good one, yes.
But those are, I mean, and all of those examples that you all gave, like those are very hard conversations to have with not only clients or with supervisees to say, because you're essentially providing them feedback on their behavior or your interactions with them. And sometimes, you know, people are really welcoming of feedback, and other times people are very defensive when it comes to feedback. And I think sometimes it's really, really difficult as a supervisor to kind of provide that feedback or even encourage students to give that feedback to their clients because it's uncomfortable for everybody. You know, and you know, counseling isn't always happy. Yeah, minors is sometimes it can be really good and sometimes it can be not good at all.
Yeah, my experience with minors, especially during COVID, depending on how young they were, is me and my office, our general approach was, I don't know if other people did this, was you could only get them to, you could pin them down for about 30 minutes, right? So to be able to make that a decent billable practice is what we would often do. I try to do about 30 minutes with the student and 30 minutes with the family. Even either direction, kid first, parents first, it doesn't matter, whatever. And just do some counseling intervention for just being stuck at home together and suffering through COVID. I had one client that his mom was a teacher. They were out of school for months here in Texas. And yeah, those two were oil and water. He was just very ADHD and had some other issues. The parents listening in is a big problem. This
Yeah.
particular family wasn't bad, but I mean, God, we could probably go into that forever. Having kids who have roommates, right? Like brothers, sisters, siblings, whatever. Like I'd be on a call with someone and looking back, I'm like, who, what is that? Like, who is that? What's going on? Please don't. And like, well, I have to. My brother's getting ready for work. Well, okay, I do understand. We'll just stop speaking for a minute. We'll let brother go.
I've had a lot of clients, and even supervisees that I supervise, they bring that up a lot about, you know, like you said, parents listening in or with kids or with people that have similar their living situation is not always 100% private. But they usually come up with pretty good ways around certain things. Like I know a lot of electronic health platforms have chats now. So sometimes if they want to say something or they'll use like a code word for, hey, I'm going to talk about this, but this is what this really is. And so you can still have the conversation, but it doesn't always, there are ways around it, but you're right. It isn't always the best.
Okay, let's sit there and read this, Megan. You can pop on and say this if you want, Megan.
I'm just thinking through, when we determine screening for supervisees, virtual sessions, live sessions, I have a supervisee right now. That's why I put in the chat. She and another clinician are sharing a family. So there's one parent and 4 minors, and it's 2 clinicians assigned to the family, and there's transportation barriers. So I'm thinking through which clients might be good for telehealth, which one might be a good fit, how is this going to affect the identified caregiver? Because they're the one that's going to be doing the transportation. Is there, Medicaid transport that could help this family? And how do we really manage that? But it's certainly one that I haven't, it's been a challenge. I'll just say that of kind of figuring out what's going to be the best for effective services and virtual versus live.
Well, Dr. Boyd, you make a good point, and it just kind of hit me as you were talking. I'm like, oh Lord. I don't know what it looks like where you guys are at, but I'm a week away from kids being out of school.
Well, yeah, and then there's that.
Yeah, we have a summer of this nightmare. Yeah, we just have this absolute, like, I'm just like, oh God, what are we gonna do?
Summer is a whole other monster in CMH, but yes, we'll be talking through that soon.
Yes, and yeah, and then what did you say? You said something, but yeah, no, I was really trying. I'm the same way. You're telling me, going, we got a family of 5 with 2 clinicians, and my first is like eyebrows up, going, how's that working? And then transportation issues and all those things.
And just privacy and confidentiality and
Well,
feeling comfortable even saying anything.
Get this, the minors range from age 8 to 17.
oh Lord.
So like and then the parent, the identified caregiver, is receiving their own services.
Yeah. So it's
And then
not like they're like some of the kids are even like, 2 and 3 and 4 where
Oh no. They're all in
they all understand.
Well, and you can only presume, families that size, we all do it, that what level of caregiving does that 17-year-old have over the others, right? So
exactly. You're
yes,
right.
it is a mess, and I agree with Kristen's little comment there on yeah, if they don't have the strong skills in class, or you have some question, if you have some question of them when you first meet them as a site supervisor, maybe telehealth isn't the full way to go. Let's not try to use let's try not to use telehealth as some mitigating factor to avoid damage, because I don't think it's going to work that way. Yeah, those things just, yeah, you got me really thrown with the whole kids about to be out of school and all of those things. And then keeping in mind, I ran into this experience and really almost wanted to thump someone in the back of the head. On a supervision issue during COVID, I was in a grocery store that has kind of a seating area, like a Starbucks kind of thing, right? And I walked by a group of people I knew, and like, hey, what are y'all up to? They're like, oh, we're having supervision, which started, I'm like, wait, what? Like a public place. This was a site supervisor that I knew, and 3 other students that I knew, but weren't part of my university, my school, my program, my anything. And they are sitting there having supervision. That to be said, it's really hard. Yeah, exactly. It's really hard to control the student, the intern, the supervisee, and their environment as well sometimes, because sometimes this goes, again, convenience, old hat. They just didn't really get it, and they weren't controlling. Yeah, they're like you're saying there, their physical limitations, their limitations to their environment, things like that. And then yeah, them having those level of issues going in supervision, not to protect it, because they're just so used to being a counselor, they think, or student, that they think they can have those communication or those talks just freely. Let me see, I'm reading. That one I have run into. You guys see her comment in the chat, having an issue with an individual, a student or supervisee who has severe physical limitations, wanting to do telehealth only because of their disability. But they also had some skills and disposition concerns. I don't know, maybe we've had the same couple of students before. I've had them at a couple of universities, and it's really hard because they are dealing with a legitimate physical limitation in which telehealth would be easier. Completely relate to that. Would be easier, but again, screening for fit goes 2 ways. Are we sure that they fit in that situation? Are there going to be the multitude of problems, or is this really the best fit? That is never fun because you get to decide as a site supervisor on your license and as a supervisor on your license if you're going to let that thing go or not.
When I think sometimes it's also, I don't know, maybe during COVID, but I don't know if there's anyone that, aside from someone outside of someone that's licensed, how many, students can get the experience of what being a counselor is virtually via telehealth 100% of your clinical experience, like post-graduation, even post-graduation, like that's a lot of learning. That's a lot of learning that they might be missing or they're not getting, or, especially it really depends on the student for sure. And the supervisee, but, that's kind of our ethical call whenever it comes to working with students or working with supervisees around appropriateness of telehealth for them.
I went back to see because I missed part of this, Michael. I was looking at your comments, and yeah, not only is that a concern with patients, it can be a concern with supervisees. Just all of those things. Dr. Colorso mentioned it. Is it just easier for us to do this driving to work? Well, I'm going to stop at McDonald's and get my food, and this disruption. I'm going to eat while we're doing this, and all of that stuff. We'll talk more about it tomorrow. But one of the big deals is that professionalism, right? That when is it too casual in supervision? When is it too casual in clinical work? When is it too casual? What level of communication, language, and understanding does that individual have at all of those levels of not only communication between people, but also technology and other things that we'll talk about.
Yeah, well, the professionalism of what that looks like. We'll talk about that tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more. Anybody have anything? Cool. All right, so this time around, we're going to give everybody the opportunity to sit there, and we'll give you a few minutes, 3 to 5 minutes or so, to just kind of read through this. And then once you've read through it, I would like everyone to start kind of putting in, first of all, just like your visceral response to this whole thing. And then kind of answer those questions at the bottom. What are you going to address in the next supervision meeting? What kind of things do we need to change? What are your next steps? Just kind of really lay out some of your plans and approaches, and then we'll talk through it a little bit, and then we'll be close to done. Watch the chat. Thanks, Chris.
Just share kind of any, doesn't have to be next steps, but any concerns that you see or anything that you would be concerned about as a fellow clinician, as a supervisor, as a client, any one of those roles, you can kind of take the perspective of what this example would look like. This is the same case study from earlier as well, so.
By the way, why are you picking on my state, local Texas University? You wrote this. I didn't do it. I'm offended.
I'm surprised you should just notice that.
Oh, no, I didn't. I just waited until now to be a smarty about it. Good starting point. Missing supervision, showing up late. How's she doing with the clients?
Yep.
Scary thought, but probably the same. I got all kinds of professors out there. I expect some interaction here, folks. While they're hiding, I'm sitting there thinking about the miss of supervision. It really stinks when they're no longer students, because it's like kind of hard to have a consequence. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Providing telehealth out of state and another state, you run into problems in both of your states. The receiving state, the state you're currently in. Like, people sometimes think that the law is only a one-way thing, but the law is typically two ways. And you could, at a federal level, can receive if you ever go and look at some of the telehealth certificates and things you can get, you got to remember that Federal Communication Administration laws can often go two ways, and so that can be a violation both ways. Good for the client for telehealth.
William, that's a really good point of even being able to, that it doesn't say that she notified anyone whenever missing supervision. And you're right, with all of the technology that's available, there has to be some method of communication. It doesn't have to be the best one, but it has to be something. That's a really good point.
Absolutely. Location of all. I'm going to hold you to that, William, as one of our students, right? The importance of consistency of supervision. Yes. So I have a question for you. You can put it in the chat. You can speak, Dr. Brown, because it came to my mind, but I'm kind of curious to see, at what point would someone feel that they would have to cut this person loose from their supervision under their license? Are we there yet? Or are there other behaviors to kind of think about, like, is it 3 strikes, or are you more of a,
For me, I think you just kind of touched on something, the 3 strikes or whatnot. Is this the first time that this has happened? How egregious is the situation? Is this a pattern of behavior? Certainly if there's a pattern behavior of behavior and the student doesn't seem to be correcting or addressing the behavior, then I would certainly be concerned with continuing with the student. At that point, it says that the student has kind of a background and whatnot, and sometimes it's challenging, probably more challenging, I think, sometimes to train or to educate someone who has been in a para field, because you almost have to untrain them and retrain them, and they have a level of pseudo confidence. And on one hand, you don't want to be a cold, wet blanket. On the other hand, you've got to address some of the potential bad habits that they have developed in the para field that don't translate or transfer into their new field. So there's a lot of elements here to really kind of look at and to address and to be concerned with regards to this student.
That para field is a wonderful point and probably very easily overlooked. It's funny you say that. I'm holding office hours last night, and I had 2 students with some of these concerns. They're not ethical, this is not this bad, but nothing like that. But the concern was having to explain to them, like, how do I do field work and do these things ethically and do all these things? But they had that para experience, and so they had that a little overconfident. So what I had to have a conversation about is, no one's going to judge you while you're doing internship. If you need to go off in the world and just get a job to pay the bills, if you got to go work at Home Depot or McDonald's or whatever to bring in that $15, $18 an hour you need, get out of the para field, because you see a lot of that blurring of their lines. One of the reasons we don't let them work and get paid at the same place a lot of times, and why we have so many limits on those kind of things. And what supervisors have to look at that and go, wait a minute, you know, um, picking on somebody that, maybe worked in a field, in a very specific field, maybe worked, and, like you're saying, Dr. Brown Lang, they worked in a residential treatment facility. And so they have the habits of the facility, but not the clinical professional habits that we would expect of a clinician.
I'm curious, and this might be a really good side conversation that applies to what we're talking about here, from both you and Dr. Colarusso. What do you look for as far as good fit for a supervisee, and what elements do you look for as far as like, this is not a good fit, or maybe I need to dismiss this student, or what have you?
I will tell you, right off the top, for me, because I am in Texas, and the supervision laws in Texas have gotten so very tight that I am so picky about our supervise that I barely supervise anybody right now, because you have to trust and really look at their ethics, their background, their knowledge, some of their early interactions. I will tell you, my gut is I would probably be one step away from letting this particular student go, because they are very common to audit in this state. I would not want to be able to show that supervisions were missed. That would be bad for me, more so than for her, the student. You look for people that, the simple things. Do they show a healthy degree of professionalism, right? Like, do they show up on time? I live in a world where this is just how I am. Like 15 minutes early is on time, and on time is late. So I expect to see that person ready to go early, and let's get it done. This is just kind of like those levels of professionalism. I have expectations that are high for them, because not only is it about me and my license and the clients and your practice and all those things as us as supervisors and clinicians, it's also just about the whole ethics of it all. And so you want the most professional people you can find. How do you screen those? I typically do interviews like a lot of places do an interview with them. I check references. So the ones that I have now that I'm supervising, I actually check references. It's like a job interview. I'll reach out to their school and be like, hey, what can you, I typically, for the most part, do not supervise someone I do not personally know, or the individual is coming in. I know the person who's referring them to me very well. Those are the two safest things that I typically do. So a lot of times I'll supervise someone that is here in town, that went to the same university I did, that had the same professors I did when I was getting my master's or my doctorate. And then I will take those people because I trust them. Dr. Colarusso?
I mean, I would say similar things. I had a supervisee who I worked with. I wasn't her direct supervisor, but she was in with the other clinicians, and she kind of asked a lot of different people to be her licensure supervisor. And this was at Community Mental Health. And at the time, she just did not have she had already graduated, and she did not have very good skills at all, and was receiving a lot of feedback around just how she conceptualized clients and like her professionalism and a lot of things that Dr. Dixon had shared. But fast forward 2 or 3 years since I have been in that job, one of my friends who's also in the field, he reached out to me because he does a lot of supervision. And she had been, I don't want to say fired, but kind of like asked to basically say like that they weren't comfortable working with her for a variety of reasons for different clinicians. And one of the people that I know in the field, he reached out to me and he said, hey, do you know so-and-so? She used to work where you used to work. And she was reaching out to more and more site supervisors. And he said the same thing. He was like, I did a screening with her. And he was like, I've met with her, 2 times already. He's like, but I just don't feel like this is a good fit. Like, I don't feel like I'm a good fit for her. And I can't really provide what she wants or what she needs. And she had this idea of what she wanted to do that was very straightforward, and had a really hard time deviating from that idea. And so again, I don't know where she is now, but similarly, and I don't really like supervising people that I don't really know who their clients are, or I don't have access to their clients, or I don't know populations that they've worked with necessarily. And I am a big thing about professionalism and being on time and showing up, or all of those things too. So
Thank you both.
Oh, thank you. There we go. Okay. Actually, who was it asked me? Was that Kristen? Who asked me that? Yeah. So if you don't mind, Dr. Colarusso,
I have to
real
stop
quick-
sharing it for a second and I'll put them in there.
yeah, could you pull up that the first one? The consortium. I put this in the chat, and at some point you guys will get access to our you can get access to our recording, and we can get our presentation out to anybody who wants it. But the she's pulling up now the first one on the list. The other things that we have listed, we're not going to go through all of them, but I really wanted to show folks what this one looked like. Of resources, places you can go and get training for telehealth, how you can go about getting a board certificate. Thank you, Dr. Colors. They're all in the chat there. And so this one is wonderful. I mean, it's just the most awesome thing ever. So basically what it is, it's a national consortium, but you can click on different parts. If you'll go up to us for a second for me, or maybe it'll let you on this map. This tells you all about it. Then it says centers. So if you can click on that spot that says centers for me. Scroll down. So each one of these areas is a regional office for telehealth. You can click on these and get all the supports and everything you need. It'll tell you all the laws in those regions. It'll tell you everything you need to know about mental health, medicine, all of those things. And it covers every region in the US, Alaska. But not only that, if you're really interested, if you scroll up again, Dr. Colarusso, up here, the webinar series are wonderful. They're completely free. There are 1 million of them. Why should you attend kind of things. They show when they are so you can come and participate. But if you go down, you can get yourself invited to them. So register for one. Or any of the past ones are on here and they're recorded, and they're fabulous. These people are experts, and they go over 1 million different topics. They can help you with all kinds of things. They provide local and state level support at some of the different based on the different regional offices that are there. What else is there? They also, somewhere across the top, which is all additional, in addition to the web series they on here, one of the places, resources. They have a YouTube channel. There we go. We have a YouTube channel. And it covers all kinds of things about reimbursement, about services. So you don't have to, but you can go. One of these, I've seen it before. I hadn't pulled it up, but it's in here. One of these is the current, most recent laws, just on check boxes on what current laws are regarding telehealth in that state. Who's restricted, who's allowed, who's this, who's that. And then, they also include District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. All the things you can think of. What else is in there? They have different ways in which you can get advice and services and reach out to people to help you in your region or in your state. That's what they're there for. They're an information hub, and click on it. Let's see here. What else was on? Yeah, upcoming events you can register for, conferences. A lot of the rural health agencies. The rural health agency, some of them that I'm a part of, they will post their conferences or their discussions. So like we were talking about the frontier land and Front Range and a lot of that stuff earlier that people don't hear enough about. There's also links in here to the rural hub initiative. If you go there, it actually the school, one of the schools here in town produces the newsletter, and it'll tell you basically state by state what the areas are, what things are lacking in your area. So if that is, as we were talking about earlier, if it's bandwidth, if it's access to care, if it's certain levels of care, they cover dental health, mental health, physical health, childcare health, all those things. So that is one of the greatest sites ever. And then as you go through it, you're just going to rabbit hole into like a million different things. That is just a wonderful resource. And then also she shared these others with you that are in there. You go to any of these sites, those are their formal names. You can find out about trainings on telehealth, but also some of them still provide information on sites, state laws, state rules, ethics, all the things we've talked about today and things we'll talk about tomorrow. I think we're almost there. So do we have any final questions?
We'll be here tomorrow at the same time, so.
Tomorrow's is more specifically site supervision, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, but of course we can't really separate telehealth and the others, so. Looking forward to seeing everyone. If you don't have any questions, we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.